have the, what is this one? This one's Immigration Nation. There's so many of these that I'm doing every day. Sometimes I can't even remember which form we're on right now. And so welcome to the Canadian Immigration Institute. And this is Immigration Nation, where I invite in a guest that is an expert in their field to share insight on areas that are of interest to all of you. So I created this as a platform to really pull out so many people that are doing things right, who are going out of their way to, to help and to create information and knowledge and understanding with respect to immigration. And today is no different. Today, we are going to talk about study permits, and not the regular study permit discussion. We're going to talk about the statistics, what is really happening. So I'll introduce my guest in a second. All right, I've got LJ here, Lou Janssen. How are you doing? So what do you prefer? Do you prefer LJ or do you prefer Lou? What do you prefer?
So Will affectionately calls me LJ, Will, who
Yes, he
you
does.
had in your show.
Yes.
My professors used to call me Jansen. I go by Lou or Jansen, really. I have no preference, to be quite frank. So whichever you feel like today.
Hey, I like LJ, and I like LJ. Let's roll with that one. We'll make it stick. Awesome. Welcome to the show. It's great. I really appreciate you taking the time to come. And I've been waiting for a while, anxiously, to have you come, because you've got stuff that no one has released. You've got things that are just new, that those who are, waiting to join us, and they're already spiraling up. We've just about got 80 people watching live now, and it will just increase. Those of you who are tuning in, Lou is he's an immigration lawyer, and he is also fascinated with stats. So Lou, how did you get into this stuff? First tell us a little bit about your practice, where you're located, and what you do.
I'm located where my laptop is located. So whether that's in a beach in the Philippines, for example, or whether that's in rural France, or whether I'm in Ottawa or in Toronto, but officially I'm in Toronto. So I basically run my practice virtually. Even pre-COVID, I've been traveling around, hopping around different places just to see potential clients and just enjoy life while do what I love best, which is to practice immigration law.
Awesome. So what got you into immigration? So when you went to law school, was that always something that you wanted to do, was immigration? Or is this kind of a new, you kind of fell into it like all of us did?
There's, I guess, like on the personal side, it's always been something in the back burner for me. Always something I've always been interested in, but I didn't want to pigeonhole myself into immigration law right away when I entered law school. I had applied to most Quebec law schools. In fact, I was in Montreal. The intention was to stay in Montreal. I ended up at the University of Ottawa, where I pursued both the English and French programs. So I'm trained both in civil law and in common law. I basically got called to the bar in Ontario. But during law school, I was doing a lot of volunteer work on top of expanding my horizons, I suppose, in corporate law, in contract law, and all the black letter law courses, really, that I was interested in. In the end, when I had finished my articling, I decided to start my own practice in immigration law, back to basics, back to things that I love. And it's been a fun ride, really, since that day. My interest in statistics really boils down back to my days in undergrad. I am a sociology major. I did my master's in sociology at the National University of Singapore, where I did mostly historical and qualitative stuff, but always been fascinated with statistics and how it sort of like gives us the big picture view of things. And I think I just like transposed that interest back in my academic years into my practice in immigration law. And, as it happens, I'm also a fan of doing access to information requests. I know that Will does that a lot. I know that Stephen Mearns does that a lot. And I've managed to dig up data since 2007. So for those of you who are into statistics, I got longitudinal data, historical data from 2007 across all countries. But for today's presentation, I kind of narrowed it down to 21 countries of interest and ran some statistical analysis for our friends joining us today, Mark.
Very cool. Okay, so Lou, if someone is watching this and they're wondering, all right, how does this really impact on me, and as I'm trying to make decisions on studying in Canada. And, so this data, what we're going to share, these stats, how is it going to benefit the listener as they tune in? Because some people are going to say stats. Well, how is that really applicable to me? What would your response be?
Good question. I mean, we know that it's kind of like becoming more and more an uphill battle to apply for study permits. Having statistics on hand, understanding how these decisions from a bird's eye view perspective work, allows us to mitigate our risks or manage the risks and entering the wonderful world of applying for study permits. For example, according to our findings, there are certain data sets or certain countries. If you're coming from certain countries, applying for at certain jurisdictions, you would probably be better off, advancing certain things or making sure that your evidence in proving your finances are much, much more robust than, say, for example, someone applying from the US. In fact, the US is one of our, points of interest or points of interest countries in this
Mhm.
data set. And what we found is that there is I guess, like a red line. We can probably call it as an informal red line when it comes to study permits, approvals, I should say, and GDP per capita. There's a threshold that basically determines whether that country has a relationship, like the approval rate of a country has a relationship with a GDP per capita of a country. So what do I mean by all that?
Yeah.
If your
Maybe
country's
define
GDP per
GDP
capita,
for those who don't
that's right,
understand. Yeah, define that.
for sure. So GDP is basically, if you head on over to the next slide, Mark,
Yeah.
it's actually defined there. Thank you. GDP per capita measures the sum of marketed goods and services produced within a national boundary, averaged across everyone who lives within this territory. So what does that mean in plain English? So basically, you're looking at the income of a particular country. That is basically the total output of its services, if it's production within a given national boundary. And if you do that per capita, you divide it by the number of population. For example, if let's say Canada had a GDP total output of 100 million, and let's say there's I don't know, like a certain number of people in Canada, let's say 100 people, then that would be $1 million per capita, for example. But of course, that's not the real number. So that would vary from one country to the next. And of course, there's also purchasing power parity, which means that you adjust those dollar values according to the I guess what we could say the cost of living, the purchasing power of a particular country, for example. Obviously, the US would be a ratio of 1 to 1 because they're using US dollars as a measure here. And I pulled out Canada. Apparently, it's 96 Canadian cents to the US dollar, for example, just to have some sort of comparison. Now, what we did find, actually, the too long didn't read or TLDR version of this whole presentation is that there is a positive correlation between the variables being the GDP per capita, PPP adjusted for each country, and the approval rate. And I think I talk about that in the next slide, Mark.
You
If
bet.
you
So just to pull
head over
everybody
to that.
in,
Sure.
we'll kind of pull everybody back in. So what LJ is talking about here is that this data isn't anywhere. He created this himself. And so based on actual statistics, so from the access to information and the available data that Stats Canada puts out and from immigration. And so what he's saying is that there's a correlation between the country you are coming from, that country's gross domestic product and other factors, that actually influences the rate in which immigration is willing to approve your study permit. And that's really what we're diving down to. And obviously I've way oversimplified that. But for those of you who are watching and are thinking and wondering, why is it so hard to get a study permit approved in my country? Why? I know someone in a different country, it doesn't seem like they did the same thing that I did, and theirs got approved and mine got rejected. And so what you take from this is really what it comes down to is understanding some of the, at least from a statistical standpoint, what you can expect and how hard you're going to have to work to get your study permit approved. All right, let's shift over here, Lou, and we will advance to the next slide.
Oh, that was a nice summary. I wouldn't call it an oversimplification. I think it was perfectly stated. But just on that note, at the end of the day, I should probably put I guess, like a note there, a very important one, that all decisions are individualized. And, the stats really just give us a bird's eye view. This is broken down by country. So with that, I can go on to my key findings in this particular study. And we can say that there is a positive correlation between the number of study permits approved and PPP adjusted GDP per capita, ranging from about $2,000 US to 15,000 US dollars. Now, for those countries with, per capita PPP adjusted GDP per capita of more than 15,000 US dollars, the relationship appears insignificant. So what does this mean? So basically, if Mark, do you mind heading over to the next slide, for example?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So I know that I actually just, plopped over some stats here for the nominal GDP, but basically the principle is the same. We just have to distribute it a bit more to the right. But there are two axes here, like X and Y. So the axis at the bottom you're looking at would be the GDP per capita, and the one going at the left side would be the percentage rate of the rate of approval for study permits, I should say. So you can see that those who have, those countries that are bunched up to the left, those are the ones that have a statistically positive relationship. And that's divided according to year and data and country. But if you look at the right side, you'll see that the ones that are distributed towards the right, they tend to have a higher GDP per capita and tend to have higher approval rates. And there is a cutoff. You can see here it's 10,000. This is nominal GDP, by the way. But when we adjust it for PPP, or purchasing power parity, it moves up to 15,000. And this becomes really interesting as we shuffle along those slides. And I think this slide deals with 2007 to 2012. The next one, if you don't mind, Mark, that would be 2013 to 18. And finally, 2019 for the next. And don't worry, guys, we'll make these slides available to you later. Mark will include a link, and I'll make sure that this is publicly available. And further on to the next slide, you'll see the raw numbers as well, just for everyone's benefit if people want to run their own numbers and their own statistical analysis. Now, if you don't mind heading over to slide number 9, for example, I think this would be interesting. And it's one of my favorite countries as a case study for study permits, because there's a significant number of Indian nationals coming into Canada through a study permit. And you can see a certain crisscrossing of lines here for approved and refused. So there was a significant jump in categorization for India's per capita. They moved to what's called a high, an upper middle income country in or around 2010. So you can see that the lines crisscrossed. Essentially, approval rates have overtaken refusal rates in India at that point. Granted, we don't know what the volumes are. We can't break it down by region. We can't break it down by class. We don't have that data. I don't think we can ask for. We can probably ask for that from immigration, but that's going to take another ATIP. But it's interesting that it coincided with the year that India graduated from a low income country to from a lower income country to an upper income country, essentially. And just like parsing through some more of the stats here.
Yeah. So Lou, I was just going to jump in. So what that is telling us is that, India is a great case study, because as the GDP of that country increased, and as it reached that certain threshold or red line or whatever, statistically significant threshold, that's when the approval and refusal rates really started to make a difference. So we go from, in 2007, if we flip back here to the screen that you have here. So 2007, the refusal rate is probably right around, what is it, 64, 65%. And then
That's right.
and then you go to today, and it's had periods of upward and downward. We're right around that refusal rate is about 20% less. Oh, I should say about 20% less, like 40. What do we have here? We've got 35. Actually, it's about 35 or
Right.
36% refusal. So, yeah. So, and that's largely, you're saying that, at least if you look at statistics, one significant contributor to that is how well the country is doing.
That's right. Um, we do have outliers for sure, and it's not all dictated by GDP per capita. And I guess the key takeaway here, and as I was mentioning earlier, is that purchasing power parity adjusted, the threshold that you're looking for is really $15,000. So if, say, for example, your family is making significantly less than that, you probably would not have a chance of getting an approval. It really is incumbent on you to prove that you actually will have that proof of financing for your application. But here's another interesting case study, and as I was mentioning, it's not all about income. So
Okay.
the Philippines has been an upper middle income country for quite some time, ranging from 5,000 GDP PPP per capita adjusted for quite some time. And yet in 2014, there was a dip. Um, what I could associate this, and I was trying to look for historical data that's not really linked to statistics, trying to put in some qualitative analysis, is that there were two crises, diplomatic crises that hit the Philippines in 2014, tensions with China, Hong Kong, and on top of it, a barrage of super typhoons that increased possibly like a demand. And I was looking at the raw numbers for the Philippines, and there was actually a significant jump in the number of applications from the Philippines. So there's more demand essentially for applications for study permits at around this time. But of course, it started to level off after that. So it was a blip essentially. But what we're trying to establish here is that there are these outliers and weird cases, and those are interesting cases most of the time that would show to us that it's not all about the stats. And then another outlier here is Saudi Arabia, because even if it has a very high per capita, there's been a spike, or it's not really a spike, but there's been a trend of refusals going up, and of course the approvals going down correspondingly. The only thing that I could really find here, Mark, that would create like any sort of like blip in the news for Saudi Arabia was starting 2015. There's been, I suppose, regional tension in or around Saudi Arabia and Yemen. On top of that, there was also the succession. Their king died. There was a succession issue, I think, and basically there was a regime change. Not really a regime change, it was basically a succession of power. And there was a period of uncertainty in terms of like, what will Saudi Arabia look like? But we really can't explain why it's sustained at the levels of 30% refusal for Saudi Arabia. I think like further study is merited in that case. Again, stats give us bird's eye view, but if we want to dive into like what happened, we would really have to like, open it up and try to find more points for analysis statistically or even qualitatively.
Mm-hmm. Now, one question I have with these statistics that we're looking at right here, are these based on the visa offices that are located or servicing these countries, or is it based on the citizenship of the applicant?
Good question. It's actually based on the visa offices.
Mm-hmm. So
I
I
have a
wonder.
data set. Sorry, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, no, no. You said you've got a data set. Go ahead.
I got data sets for citizenship as well, but the ones that I do have for citizenship only go back until 2016. I figured that I wanted to do a longitudinal one that takes into account the visa offices. I think they're a bit more interesting in respect to their income levels, I suppose, because if you're located at a particular jurisdiction and you're under a particular visa office, you would probably be making correspondingly what people would be making in that geographic region.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if we go back to this again, I wonder if there's any connection with the numbers of temporary residents in those countries that are seeing a lack of future for them, who then are turning and considering Canada as a possible option and then are applying for, in this case, study permits to come to Canada when they may be foreign nationals in these countries. So I wonder if that plays a role at all in this. And, you know, as everybody knows, you can be living in the UAE or any of these Middle Eastern countries, and the pathway to citizenship really doesn't exist. And even the concept of permanent residence is really contingent on maintaining work status. And as people start to realize that, hey, this really isn't a long-term future, then you know, I wonder what role those individuals playing, you know, applying for study permits, you know, affects immigration, saying, well, you don't meet those thresholds. You know, where are you going back to? You haven't been, you know, living in the Philippines for 15 years. You haven't been living in Pakistan for 20 years. You know, I know that's a pretty absurd example. Like, you know, your family's been living in the UAE, you know, since you were born, even though you're a Pakistan citizen, and now you're coming to study in Canada. And, you know, what ties do you have to your home country, right? Those kinds of questions. I wonder how those affect these statistics.
At this point, we don't have the answer, but that's a really good question, Mark. I would suggest for those of your listeners who are sociologists or economists and migration
Yeah.
studies folks, this is a really good research question, I would say.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that one of the organizations that I'm, the Canadian Bar Association is a member of, is the Conference Board of Canada and their National
Mm.
Immigration Center. And these types of, you know, these types of research questions, although they don't go to the heart of what's happening really in Canada, I think it's worth it. You know, it bears further examination. So I'm definitely going to bring that up with them. And in fact, Ian, who is he's Ian Reeve is one of the head individuals with the Conference Board of Canada. He's going to come and join me and talk about just some of the research they're doing with this current group of COVID, you know, candidates who are going through the TR to PR, who were part of that big 176 express entry draw, to get, and you know, to get some longitudinal empirical data on what happens with these people, their ability to fully integrate and settle, the impact that it's going to have on the Canadian economy now and into the future, because we've been so heavy, Lou, with human capital, right? It drives the ship, and the higher the human capital, there's this perception that they're going to have the greater success and chance of contributing and helping with our economy. In like manner, you know, there's always factors involved with these study permits, and if you come from a family that's very well off and you have no reason to stay in Canada, well, your chances of getting your study permit approved are astronomically greater than someone who's coming from someone from a more lower economic, socioeconomic position, who's looking to come to Canada and get an education for a better life, whether that is going back or looking for PR options in Canada. So many people, this is very, very fascinating. Okay, let's get you back to your presentation here. Should we go to the
All
next
right.
slide?
Sure, please. And here's another interesting one for you, Mark. Algeria. A few
Mm.
factors. I know for a fact that a lot of applications coming out of Algeria are processed out of the Paris visa office these days. Um, and there's also you know, this weird swing from 2007 to
Wow.
2009 to 2011. When I was working with my colleague on this for the statistical analysis here, that was her first question. She was asking, what happened to Algeria? I think just from the basic statistical standpoint, we really don't have any explanation to that, except when you look at the qualitative and historical data as to what's going on in the region. Remember about 10 years ago, Mark, the Arab Spring.
Huh.
So
You
there's
better
just a bit.
explain that, LJ.
So yeah, the Arab Spring is essentially you know, a bunch of like a lot of protests in the greater Middle Eastern region in the world, North Africa and the greater Arabia, as some would call some parts of that part of the world, really, where uh, there has been regime changes. Like, say, for example, Libya, there was a clear
Mhm.
and apparent regime change. There were a lot of protests in Tunisia, for example, and Algeria is not a stranger to all of these protests, and so is Morocco. But Algeria kind of like interestingly reflects a bit of bumps and of ups and downs. Uh, you know, the Arab Spring kind of apexed in 2011. But if you look at this, the approval rates were actually increasing from 2009 to 2011. So what's interesting, I would say here, is that the political instability doesn't necessarily lead to, at least in Algeria's case, it didn't really lead to lower approval rates. In fact, the argument could be made, perhaps it could be subject to a new study or further study, I should say, that if there was a lot of out migration out of Algeria, there would have probably been people who could afford to do that. And one way to do that was basically to temporarily relocate to Canada, whether by work or by studies, for
Yeah.
example. And you can only imagine, and this is verified by migration scholars, that those who would leave first would be those who have
Had the means.
financial mobility, they have the means to move, exactly.
Yeah.
So that would have apexed in 2011 and started to decline, and it's really reflected until the present, as the
All
stats
right.
show there.
So I'm pretty sure you don't have a slide for this, but let's take a look at Hong Kong. Right. And individuals that are looking to come from Hong Kong, our government has very proactively worked to facilitate those applications. And I wonder if there was something going on as well with IRCC during this time period as well, to facilitate that, leading up to then the further, what we're seeing now in terms of rejection rates after 2011. So it's kind of a hot and cold world. Very, very interesting. Okay.
I think I'm going to take you up on that challenge, Mark. I'm going to add Hong Kong to the deck. I'm going to update this. And again, it's going to be publicly available. I'm going to include Hong Kong just out of curiosity.
I'm very curious what's showing there.
Yeah, so this next slide is essentially just like an implications, like a reflection page. From two perspectives. One, if you're applying on your own, and next is if you're a representative, whether you're a consultant or a lawyer. So the first one I would say is, if you're applying without a representative, is that you should be mindful of country-specific requirements, especially when it comes to your finances. I actually had my assistant pull out most of the country-specific requirements for these countries that we have on the data deck. And I will also be sharing this, and we put it in a neat table. What is interesting is we saw that those who had, I guess it is just natural that those who had like a GDP per capita PPP adjusted of 15,000 below had more of an evidentiary onus of showing financial means or financial capacity, versus those who are coming from countries that have more than $15,000 per capita, for example, would have less trouble finding documentation, or they're not required to put up as much. The only outlier that we can see in this list that we have is Algeria again. Interestingly, for Algeria, they didn't actually, no, hold on, let me just pull out that table. For Algeria. So Algeria, they didn't really ask for a heavy evidentiary burden. For what I mean is that, say for example, if you're coming in from the Philippines, you need at least 6 months of a bank statement. Same goes for Bangladesh. But for Algeria, they only need a certificate of financial capacity. They're not even asking. They're not even asking for your bank statements, for example, which is pretty standard. Even for U.S. citizens, they typically ask for 3 months, in fact. But then if you're coming in from Spain, which is one of the higher approval rate countries, you're only supposed to submit a certificate of financial capacity, not even bank statements from 6 months back. But Algeria, you're seeing the same requirements as someone who would be applying from Paris, for example, which kind of makes sense because most of their applications are actually being processed out of the Paris visa office, for example.
So the rule here, so what you're trying to say, LJ, here is when we're looking at refusal rates that are just about 90%, there's no way in heck you are going to submit applications that meet just the bare minimum set out on that document checklist. You're going to treat your application like it is coming from the most difficult place in the world, which based on these statistics here, it is. these refusal rates are off the charts. Like this is yeah, and I'm sure there's correlations with other African countries as well. Like, but the ultimately when you look at this, that's crazy. And yeah,
That's right. And as an individual applying for a study permit without a representative, again, you really need to be mindful of your requirements, for example, for your visa office, but also I hope that the hope of this statistical release or this analysis, I should say, is that it gives you a bird's eye view and an appreciation of like where you stand amongst all of these countries so that you can better prepare yourself and basically put forward a complete and robust application, complete as much as it can be possible, essentially. Now, for representatives, I would say that for lawyers or consultants out there, it's incumbent on you to basically provide the proper advice on what the applicant is up against. Yes, there are general statistics, and these statistics give you the bird's eye view, give you the general stats. But at the end of the day, the decisions are individualized, and really, it boils down to the second bullet point in this, slide that it confirms something that's unacknowledged. It's an unacknowledged. Sorry, and it's a fact that's really acknowledged as like truth, but we've never really verified it. There's no statistical verification to it, at least until today. I would want to say, at least for these particular countries, that if you're coming from these particular countries, you need to mitigate these risks by, not only complying with the minimum requirement of those countries, but also putting forward a robust submission. As I said, it's basically the same, but the responsibility is higher, I suppose, like if you're a representative, because you should know
absolutely.
better.
You should know better. I'm going to pull up Sam here. He's from Algeria himself. He says, "I'm Algerian. Nothing happened during that period, at least in his mind." He said that there was no, there was the same president. There was no regime change. So, it's interesting, Sam, when we look at this, when we look at these statistics, we're obviously searching for, for reasons. And, if you have any thoughts as to what happened in 2011 with respect to your country that you can share, we're open to hear, to hear what you have to say. I'll pull up a few more as we, just a few more comments here, LJ. So Jerry says this is very discriminatory on IRCC's part. So what is your response to that? I've got my own feelings about it, but what are your thoughts on these statistics with the government, basically treating people with money differently than those who do not?
I mean, that's the danger of stats. It paints generalizing pictures, right? But at the end of the day, immigration will always say that the decisions are individualized, but yet then you start to see patterns. I suppose, like from the perspective of policy reflection, IRCC could start asking itself these questions. And I know that when Will came on your show talking about study permits as well, he was talking about like, decision-making process and certain analyses with respect to African countries, for example, where there's a higher chances of refusal, for example. So I don't disagree with Jerry, actually, that this could be very discriminatory, but it's really inconclusive at this point whether it is on purpose.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, what this statistical analysis does is it just tries to identify that threshold, that fine line, or that red line, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're a representative, you're doing, you're representing someone who's applying for a study permit. Well, what's the GDP per capita of that country? If it's below 15,000, then it better be prepared. If it's on top of 15,000, then then that's easy for sure. But still, obviously, still have to do your job. So it's really hard to answer. What are your thoughts, Mark?
Yeah, well, I think ultimately when they're trying to make determinations, like you said, it's not just the income level. It flows into all of the very, very core indicia that they're looking at when they're assessing any temporary resident application, whether it's coming to visit, whether it's coming to study, whether it's coming to work. And and one of the factors is that they look at, and it's a legitimate factor, is, do we believe that you're going to go home? Is there a high rate of overstay for individuals coming out of that visa office that are approved for temporary residence? Is there high rates of fraud within the context of applications themselves? They don't have or publish those statistics, but there's absolutely those play a role in officers' decision making. And like Lou said, every decision is an individual one, but it's colored by where you're coming from. Absolutely, it is. This is Nessa.
Absolutely.
She says that she's a former international student, and she says, "I love data and stats. Woohoo!" So I thought I just post that one up for us. All
Thanks,
right. Do
Nessa.
you want to shift back here and wrap up here?
Sure. I mean, that's pretty much as I said, I'm going to make the data available, and it's not just going to be the 21 select countries. It's going to be all of the countries, in fact, that will make the Excel sheet available to everyone.
Awesome.
You'll just have to head on over to the website and just download the data set from our website. But again, just the TLDR version of this whole thing is that if you're looking at a study permit application, or you're coming from a country where the GDP per capita is lower than 15,000, then be prepared. Be prepared to put forward a robust submission. But again, putting in a caveat there, as Mark said, it's one of the factors that they use. But certainly it's an important factor because they want to see if you have the capacity to actually pay for your way in Canada as an international student.
Yeah. And you can see here, I'll show you. So Jerry says countries such as Zimbabwe are null and void. So, this is where I don't know how many, like literally every country that you have data, you're gonna publish that, Lou.
I believe I have all countries that are
actually listed or have, yeah. So those of you who are saying, let's see what else we have here. I'll show you. So Sith is saying South Africa. Is that going to be on the list, Lou?
it's going to be on the list. Absolutely.
You can see you've got two that are asking about South Africa. So we'll put in the description of the video, once this is posted as a recording, you'll be able to go back and you'll be able to take a look at the statistics and just see what it shows for your country. So we've just covered, LJ has just covered a very high level snapshot of the ones that just are some of the highest countries for numbers of applicants that are applying. But let's just see here what else we have. Yeah, we've got this individual's asking about Cameroon.
We do have Cameroon, I think. Let's see. Although I may not have put it in there.
And Nigeria.
But I believe Cameroon was one of the countries that we looked at, were Cameroon and Nigeria as well. But guys, the conclusion is the same, really. If your country's GDP per capita, adjusted for purchasing power parity, does not exceed 15,000, then there is a relationship. If it's higher, your GDP per capita is higher, you have a higher chance of getting an approval for your study permit. Now, if it's low, what I would say is, and I would repeat it, and as Mark mentioned, you better be prepared. Put in the best submission as if you're coming in from the worst place in the universe to apply for your study permit, really. So again, the bottom line is the evidence, the burden of proof really increases the less your GDP per capita would be.
Yeah, excellent. I'm just going through here. Okay, so let's open it up just a little bit, Lou, and we'll pull in some questions that are a little bit more general nature. And so, sure. Zanab, and remember, if you guys are asking questions that are very specific about, should I apply for a study permit? Is my chances of success? What are my chances of success? Those are things that will ring this bell, and you really need to click on the links below and book a consult. Click on, you know who the expert is here. This is Lou, not Mark here, but click on Lou's link below and set up a paid consultation with him, and he can walk you through it. But Zanab says, I'd like to know if this is the right time to apply for a visa. She said, I've got an admission for the fall intake. Should I apply as planned or just defer the intake applying from SL? And so obviously, Zanab, we need a whole lot more information, and it would require a consult for us to be able to answer that question specifically. But generally speaking, LJ, what are your thoughts about the world we're in, the climate we're in right now, and whether or not students should go forward or whether or not they should defer to see what happens with the craziness that we're still experiencing here in Canada?
That's $1 million question in international education. I
Yes.
think you and I both know that Canada places international education at the it places it in a very important spot in its heart. Um, Canada loves its international students, and I know for a fact that Canada made a commitment that if your application was received before May the 15th of this year, you would get an answer whether it's a yes or a no by August the 6th. So to Zainab's question, at least this is general information. I suppose you can still try, but you can. It really will depend on a lot of factors, such as where you're applying from. You know, you have to understand that um, it really depends on the visa office where your application will go.
Yeah. That's a great response. And yeah, there's so much uncertainty. And this has been one of the challenges, LJ, that we've dealt with for the past almost year and a half now. It has been very, very difficult to advise our clients who are outside of Canada on the best options for moving forward. You know, things are becoming a lot more crystal clear for those that are here in Canada right now. But for individuals that are looking to come that are outside right now, whether that's to study, whether that's to work, whether they're trying to pursue permanent residence, there is so much uncertainty because everything is not so much contingent upon immigration as it is on the Orders in Council and Canada's decision to keep our borders closed. And
That's right.
yes, there's different rules for the U.S. There's different rules for non-U.S. Countries and coming into Canada. We just had some new Orders in Council that have, that they're getting ready if they haven't already released, and there's no clarity. There's no confirmation. So do you come to study or not? That's something that neither Lou, or I have the ability to answer. It's something that you're going to have to make a decision with yourself and the school and your agent or whoever's assisting you. But yeah, there's nothing more that we can say other than it is very, very uncertain.
I suppose as a
Excellent.
footnote to that, Mark, we can
Please.
say that in October of 2020, last year, Canada made a decision to actually allow international students.
Yeah,
Right, that's a pretty significant
it
step
is.
because if
Yeah,
you look at it from the larger picture, not all categories of individuals are actually allowed to enter Canada. You have to be, exempt from the travel restrictions, or you must be subject to a special exemption, such as international students, for example.
yeah,
So it communicates to the world that Canada really values its
they
international
do.
students. But that question of whether you should be applying, it really boils down to a lot of factors that your school is probably in a better position to answer,
Yeah,
or your agent, or your
yeah,
consultant, or your
yeah.
immigration lawyer, as Mark
Oh,
said.
yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And you can see this is a very, very interesting topic. So I'll reiterate again. So how about Cameroon, Nigeria, Tanzania, Ireland even? So these statistics, like I said, there will be a link that we will post after this live session is completed. We'll get those links that Lou's going to point you to, where he'll have the comprehensive list of countries where statistics are available, and you'll be able to go and you'll be able to check those out and look at those. So those that are, so those that are asking about all the other countries, Iran, please, Egypt, you see what we have going on here. Hey, it's many people are very, very curious about this. So it's, I'm just looking here to see, yeah, we've got another Egypt here. And yeah, this is an interesting one too. And I think a lot of people, they bring up these things like Muhammad here. LJ says, I'm from Pakistan. We believe there's a systemic bias. Our visa approval ranges between 3,900 and 4,500 since 2015. And, with the statistics, obviously, Lou's going to make all of that available to you guys. And so you'll be able to go and you'll be able to take a look and you'll be able to, use it for what you can use it for. But the key thing that we want to reiterate to all of you is that I think most people already know, if you're coming from a country where all of your friends and your other people are applying for study permits and they're getting them refused, well, understand that the burden is going to be a lot higher for you to meet. And you need to make sure that if you're doing it yourself, if you're using an agent, whoever is, well, it should be an immigration consultant or a lawyer that's assisting you with your study permit, that there is a significant amount of effort being put into that application, and that you're not just including the minimum of what it says in the document checklist. Even if you're coming from a country where the rates of approval are higher, Like, don't just rest on that laurels and say, oh, I've got an approval rate of 80% in my country, so therefore I can kind of take it easy. No, the burden is on you, and you need to do your work. You need to put together the most solid application you can so that you limit that immigration officer's discretion down to, to virtually nothing. And so that's the goal. Any other thoughts? I know we've got a bunch of other questions that are being, that are being popped in here. So any other thoughts while I'm sifting through them, LJ?
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that really, if you're coming in from, that country that has a lower GDP per capita, then you really have to put forward a very strong application. And whether you're applying on your own, uh, or if your agent or a consultant or a lawyer, I should say, is helping you do it, make sure that it's actually done in not just by hitting the minimum.
Yeah.
Go and do more than that. Really, I would say consult with an immigration lawyer. Will Tao, for example, my good friend,
Mhm.
he has basically carved out that specialization in study permit applications as well. There are a lot of immigration professionals here in Canada that can help
Yeah.
you in
Yeah.
terms of like putting together that.
Absolutely. So lots of questions here. We're kind of reached the end of our time, and I want to I want to thank everybody for posting them. Those of you who are saying, what about Sri Lanka? What about these other countries? Remember, in the comment section, we're going to put a link where you can look at the data that's there. So I know all of you are so anxious and are just wondering what the future holds. And questions like this, there's a ton of these ones. What are my chances of getting a study permit when applying from overseas? This is where we ring the bell here. And the reality is this is something that is really, it's specific to you. And the countries you're coming from do color the situation. And you can do everything right, you guys. You can do everything right and still get your application refused. And that's a reality whenever you're applying for any application to Canada. And we understand directly how disappointing that can be. And the only thing you have control over is how complete and detailed, how clear and legible your education plans are, the intentions. And remember, and this is something I'll point out to everyone and just remind everyone of, the key for you is to be able to demonstrate how this education is going to help you to go back to your home country and improve your employment prospects, your life in the future. That's the single most important thing that you're trying to demonstrate to immigration. And within those plans, if your plan suggests that you're using a study permit for the purposes of pursuing permanent residence in Canada through express entry, and some people I think have been even crazy enough to say, well, I want to study because I'm going to get an extra 15 or 30 points towards express entry. Not a good plan, you guys. So remember, that's the key. That's what's driving the ship. It's all about being able to establish how this education fits with your education, not just your previous education, but it fits in a way to improve your life when you go back home. That's one of the key factors. All right. Well, anything else, Lou, before we wrap up?
That's it. I will be releasing the stats today, as I promised, and more to come. Actually, I got some really interesting stats coming out in June. Actually, Will and I are working on a joint project together.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to have you guys both on because I can bring 3 people on here. So I'm going to have to bring you guys on to share what you're doing. And yeah, this is going to be great. So thank you so much. I really appreciate the time. And I know that this information is going to be very, very useful because there's so much misinformation out there, LJ. There's so many people that think they understand what's going on, and they've got their own opinions. But this is stats. This is at least from this standpoint, we can see where things really are with respect to the correlation between approval rates, GDP, that purchasing power within the countries that you've produced the data for. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you
All
for
right, my
having me.
friend. You bet. Take care.